presentation on DD India. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. G20 Leaders Summit is underway in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Critical issues of global hunger, sustainable development and reform of global institutions are in focus. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is representing India at the summit. In the next 1 hour or so, we take stock of the developments so far and expectations ahead. Leaders of the group of 20 major economies meet today to discuss sustainable development and transition to cleaner energy as they aim to increase the odds of a successful deal to address the global warming at the UN climate talks taking place in Azerbaijan. The host of the COP29 climate summit a day earlier had made a plea for the G20 countries to send a positive signal on the need to tackle climate change and provide a clear mandate to help save talks that had bogged down in Baku, Azerbaijan. With the world on track for its warmest year on record, leaders are seeking to shore up efforts to address climate change before Donald Trump retakes the US presidency in January. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, host of the Rio gathering, scored first-day triumph for getting 82 countries to sign up to a global alliance against hunger and poverty that he had launched. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is attending the summit in Brazil's Rio de Janeiro, will be addressing the session on sustainable development and energy transition. As India, Brazil, South Africa alliance members are also part of the Troika this year. On the first day of the G20, on the sidelines of the summit, Prime Minister Modi met several leaders. The priority points across all bilaterals were to review the cooperation in various areas of mutual interest. A look now at the key moments from Prime Minister Modi's productive first day of the summit, underscoring the collective global commitment to addressing international challenges, at the same time fostering sustainable development. And DD India correspondent Gautam Roy is in Rio de Janeiro, tells us what's in store for Prime Minister Modi and other leaders ahead.
As well, a lot of activity planned really in terms of Prime Minister Modi as far as his engagements are concerned, more bilateral engagements on the anvil. They've not been confirmed yet, but there could be as many as 4 or 5. Apart from that, the IPSA could have a meeting as well. That's India, Brazil and South Africa, a grouping that has been the Troika as well as far as the G20 summit is concerned. Apart from that, there's a session on energy transition and sustainable development as well, which Prime Minister Modi will be participating in along with the other leaders. So there's more to come as far as this G20 summit is concerned, because that is one area, energy transition, which is crucial to how the world responds to climate change. Sustainable development is again an issue where a lot of funds need to be mobilized, keeping in mind that development is taken on a track where it gels well with the environment as well. So a lot of funding in that arena too, apart from responding to the kind of disasters that are taking place because of climate change. That is another track that could further be elaborated.
And earlier, the summit of Group of 20 G20, the leading economies of the world, in Brazil issued the G20 Rio de Janeiro Leaders Declaration, addressing major global challenges and crises. It prioritized actions towards achieving concrete results in the fight against hunger and poverty in particular, emphasizing the launch of Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The declaration issued on Monday underlined the setback the fight against hunger and poverty suffered earlier due to COVID-19 and then called for greater and more effective commitment to fight the twin evils. As per the leaders' declaration, the leaders underscored the G20 commitment to the importance of food security and nutrition and the progressive realization of the right to adequate food as reaffirmed through the Deccan High-Level Principles. The G20 group also launched the Global Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty. The leader called for speedy implementation of the G20 2023 Action Plan on accelerating progress on the SDGs. The leaders expressed deep concern about humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the escalation in Lebanon. While talking about the war in Ukraine, the leaders highlighted human suffering and the negative added impacts of the war with regard to global food and energy security, supply chains, macro-financial stability, inflation, growth. The leaders condemned terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. They also recommitted to advancing the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and a safer place for all. To uphold the obligations in this regard is something the leaders committed to. G20 leaders are attending the summit in Brazil. They released the G20 Rio de Janeiro leaders' declaration on Monday, outlining their concerns over major global challenges and crises, including social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty. At the summit, Prime Minister Modi, in his opening remarks, spoke about India's efforts to alleviate hunger and poverty. Here's more.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi addressed the G20 session on social inclusion and the fight against hunger and poverty in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The Prime Minister spoke on a number of issues, including India's efforts to alleviate hunger and poverty, amplifying the concerns of the Global South, push for sustainable development goals. The Prime Minister said that the people-centric decisions taken at the G20 summit in New Delhi have been taken forward during Brazil's presidency. The Prime Minister expressed satisfaction over prioritizing SDG goals. The Prime Minister said that India focused on inclusive development, women-led development, and youth power and gave wings to the hopes and aspirations of the Global South. The Prime Minister noted that it is clear that one Earth, one family, one future is as relevant at this summit as it was last year. The Prime Minister also shared India's experiences and success stories. He said that over the last 10 years, India lifted 250 million people out of poverty, while over 800 million people are being given food grains free of cost. 550 million people are benefiting from the world's biggest health insurance scheme. Now, 60 million senior citizens over the age of 70 will also be able to benefit from free health insurance. Maintaining a focus on women-led development and social inclusion, over 300 million women micro-entrepreneurs have been linked to banks and given access to credit. Under the world's largest crop insurance scheme, over 40 million farmers have received benefits worth $20 billion. Under the farmer scheme, assistance worth over $40 billion has been given to 110 million farmers. Institutional credit worth $300 billion is being given to farmers. India is not only ensuring food security, but also focusing on nutrition. The Saksham Anganwadi and Nutrition 2.0 campaign, which is an integrated nutrition support program, focuses in particular on nutrition for pregnant women, newborn babies, children under the age of 6, and adolescent girls. Through the midday meal scheme, special attention is also being paid to the nutritional needs of school-going children. The Prime Minister said that India is also contributing to global food security. India provided humanitarian assistance to Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe recently. The Prime Minister noted that the main reason for our success is our approach, back to basics and march to the future. PM Modi remarked that we have focused not only on natural farming and organic farming, but also on new technologies. Besides, India also focused on sustainable agriculture, protection of the environment, nutrition and food security by promoting Shri Ann or millets. India developed more than 2,000 climate-resilient crop varieties and has started the Digital Agriculture Mission. India's digital public infrastructure enables social and financial inclusion. Besides, India created a new model for inclusive development that strengthens the weakest link with the aspirational districts and blocks project. The Prime Minister also said that India supports Brazil's initiative for a global alliance against hunger and poverty. This is an important step towards the implementation of the Deccan High Level Principles for Food Security adopted at the New Delhi summit. The Prime Minister also highlighted the concerns of the Global South, saying that the countries of the Global South are most adversely impacted by the food, fuel, and fertilizer crises caused by global conflicts. He said that discussions can only be successful when we keep in mind the challenges and priorities of the Global South. And just as we amplify the voice of the Global South by granting permanent membership of G20 to the African Union during the New Delhi summit, we will reform institutions of global governance. With input from Gautam Roy in Brazil, Fuzail Ahmed reporting for DD India.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi met several world leaders at Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, discussed ways to improve and strengthen bilateral ties. One of the major bilaterals was with Prime Minister Modi's meeting with United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer on Monday on the sidelines of the ongoing G20 summit. The leaders underlined the importance of resuming free trade agreement negotiations at an early date and expressed confidence in the ability of the negotiating teams to address the remaining issues to mutual satisfaction, leading to a balanced, mutually beneficial and forward-looking free trade agreement. This was the first meeting between the two Prime Ministers. The two Prime Ministers reaffirmed their commitment to strengthen the India-UK Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Prime Minister Modi announced the establishment of two new consulates general of India in the United Kingdom in Belfast and Manchester. The leaders also exchanged views on mutual interest, including on international and regional issues of significance. And Prime Minister Modi also interacted with President of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol. Prime Minister and PM Modi also met EU President Ursula von der Leyen. The leaders discussed working closely for global good. Prime Minister also interacted with President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi of Egypt during the first day of the Rio summit. Prime Minister Modi met International Monetary Fund Deputy Managing Director Geeta Gopinath in Rio. Let's now get the latest from Rio de Janeiro. DD India correspondent Gautam Roy is joining us live from Brazil. Gautam, if you can first bring us up to speed with the current developments. Day 2 focus on sustainable development and energy transition.
Yes, good morning, Shubhendu. Well, the day 2 is also a packed one for all the leaders, and particularly Prime Minister Modi, because even before this particular session that you mentioned, which is quite critical in terms of global concerns related to climate change and marrying that with sustainable development, because energy transition is a major part of how to tackle climate change. Prime Minister Modi has already reached the venue and commenced bilaterals. His bilateral with President Lula of Brazil, the host nation. The head of state of the host nation has already taken place, and if I could just give you some source-based information on what has emerged from that, is that it's been said that President Lula told Prime Minister Modi that a lot of things that they have tried to do in their G20 here in Rio have been inspired from the G20 in India.
Gautam, I'll stop you for a moment. There's an important bilateral update coming in. Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting the President of Brazil, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Those visuals, a warm handshake between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President da Silva. Also a hug, those visuals of a bilateral that just took place between the two leaders. President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil with Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India. Those visuals coming in from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on the sidelines of the G20 summit Rio edition. Prime Minister Modi is also engaging with the leaders from across the world. The G20 nations in particular host Brazil this year. And there Prime Minister Modi with the leader, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva of Brazil. Visuals of a bilateral meeting and a warm handshake and a hug between the two leaders. Much rides on the manner in which the two leaders steer this edition of the G20. India had hosted the G20 last year, 2023, in its presidency, and this year Brazil is the president of the G20. Those visuals that came in a short while ago. Prime Minister Narendra Modi warmly engaging with the president of Brazil, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Important bilateral meetings are taking place on the sidelines of the G20 summit. This is one of the important ones. Prime Minister Modi engaging with the host nation, leader of the host nation, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, President of Brazil. The body language of both the leaders demonstrates the warmth that the two leaders and the two nations share. Those visuals of a special hug and a handshake between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Lula da Silva. And Gautam Roy continues to be with us live from Rio de Janeiro. Gautam, we just saw the visuals of a warm engagement between Prime Minister Modi and President Lula da Silva. The bilaterals have been particularly important on the sidelines of the Rio summit. Gautam?
Yes, certainly, and as far as I know, Shubhendu, that bilateral is still on. As I mentioned, a big part of what the conversation that President Lula had with Prime Minister Modi was about how Brazil has tried to carry forward the agenda that was set last year in New Delhi when the G20 summit took place there in September, and they also appreciated how they have tried to learn from how the G20 summit was organized in New Delhi, because it was a grand success over a period of 1 year. There were 277 meetings, and over 100,000 people had come for the summit as well in September. So it was a grand event, and Brazil has appreciated that and said that they've tried to borrow from that as well. And clearly, these bilaterals are one big reason that the leaders of the G20 and so many other invited states and international organizations, a total of 140 of them, heads of states, governments and international organizations, have come to Rio as well, because they get to meet with each other and take bilateral and plurilateral relations forward as well. And that's what Prime Minister Modi has also been doing. He had 6 bilaterals yesterday. You mentioned most of them, and today at least 4 are slated. These include Argentina, Chile as well, and we are hoping that there might be some sort of a communique or a statement issued on the IPSA as well, which is India, Brazil and South Africa. If in case the leaders don't get to meet, there have been efforts made to ensure that happens, but it is a tight and packed schedule for all of them. Prime Minister Modi will be flying out as well later in the afternoon. So it has been a very, very hectic kind of an engagement for him. Apart from that, of course, he's slated to attend this important session on sustainable development and energy transition that we talked about earlier as well.
The Rio summit, how does the Rio Declaration articulate the critical issues of hunger, conflict and global governance altogether?
Well, yes, it was a challenge to put it all in context, and it has been done in 85 paragraphs covering a wide range of issues, a large amount of space, or let's say a lot of words spent on referring to these issues as well of conflict, where they have the G20 nations have called for a comprehensive ceasefire in both the case of Ukraine as well as Gaza. And Gaza, of course, there is a process on right now, even in the case of the Hezbollah. So we know that they have been urging for a comprehensive ceasefire, and that's something that has come across in letter and spirit over here. by the leaders as well. And the issue of climate change, a lot of interest and a lot of watchfulness was there as to what the G20 leaders will say because of COP29 being on in Baku, Azerbaijan, and news emerging that there was a bit of a deadlock on how climate finance will be handled because there is a need to escalate climate finance from the billions to trillions, and that's the kind of language that was there in the G20 Rio Declaration as well. Now, there are interpretations of this. Some people are disappointed, some saying this is a bit of a progress at this leadership level. A sense of direction is emerging from here. So a bit of a mixed reaction, a mixed bag on that, but at least there is an incremental move to talk about trillions instead of billions at this top level of the world's 20 top economies, which includes the European Union and the African Union now as well, which is 55 countries. So it is still open to interpretation, and one really cannot say that things have failed at this juncture because we've known there's been a history of COPs being extended beyond the slated date. So it's not over till it's over, Shubhendu.
Right. And Gautam, finally, in a few hours from now, the Rio summit is going to conclude. Just want to get your final points on the expectations regarding the conflicts that continue to dominate the global geopolitics. How are the leaders looking at those developments? Those conflicts continue as they did for the past couple of years or so.
Well, yes, certainly, Shubhendu. I guess the maximum amount of concern has been expressed about the conflicts and the way that they have refused to die down, to peter out. There have not been ceasefires despite multiple efforts. So the leaders have been urging that all sides should sit down together and resolve things unless they want a further escalation. We've seen that happening despite processes being on to resolve both the Ukraine and the West Asian conflicts. But these are not the only conflicts that are confronting the world at this stage. President Lula, in his inaugural speech, had mentioned how the number of conflicts that are unfolding right now in different pockets of the world is the largest ever since the Second World War, and that is what the truth is, and it has impacted people hugely. People have been pushed out of their homes. There have been forced migrations, which is impacting global levels of hunger and poverty as well, and a global alliance has now been formed to address that issue because there are FAO figures. That's a UN body that says 773 million people around the globe are still facing hunger and poverty. And Prime Minister Modi said that in India, the last 9 years has led to 250 million people coming out of poverty. Poverty alleviation steps, the multiple programs and schemes that India unveiled since 2014 have impacted the people. Free food grain as well. The world's largest universal health insurance scheme, which has now got elderly in its ambit as well. So these are the ways, solutions that India has found to address poverty and its alleviation in, and it's not led to a complete 100% solution, but progress is being made on a daily basis. One can only tackle these issues incrementally. If one sets out to do things immediately, it never really works out.
Right.
One can just then throw up their hands and say it's not working, but you just can't give up.
Gautam, thank you very much for joining us with those updates from Rio de Janeiro. Gautam Roy getting us the latest from the developments at the G20 in Brazil. Taking forward the conversation, India at the G20, I'm joined by two eminent guests. Let me welcome Ambassador Mohan Kumar, former senior diplomat. Also joining me in the studio is Dr. Sandipani Dash, Professor, Department of African Studies, University of Delhi. Good evening and welcome, gentlemen. Ambassador Kumar, if I can come to you first. Look at the theme of the G20 Brazil this year, building a just world and a sustainable planet. It sounds very ambitious given the kind of geopolitical developments that we are looking at today. How well has the issue been able to address, and what has been achieved according to you so far in the engagement, sir?
So thank you very much for having me. I think I'll begin by saying that Brazil finds the international circumstances slightly more favorable than Delhi, than India when we conducted the G20. When we conducted the G20 summit, the geopolitical tensions were much more serious and so on. Now President Trump has been elected. It's clear and certain that Ukraine, for example, there will be a diplomatic solution sooner or later. So that's the first point I will make. The second point I will make is that the Rio leaders' declaration is borrowed quite heavily from the Delhi summit declaration. In fact, the paragraph on Ukraine is almost word by word the same. And they openly, explicitly accept that they have referred to the discussions on Ukraine in New Delhi declaration. There is also an acknowledgement that Delhi summit and the Indian presidency has done a lot of work on the reform of multilateral development banks and so on. So I would say that the Brazilian Rio declaration is really a follow-up of the Indian G20 summit or the New Delhi declaration in that sense. Having said that, Brazil, as you rightly said, wanted to focus on three things. One, President Lula was particularly attached to the idea of the fight against hunger and poverty because of his own background, because of the kind of issues that he had to face when he was young. So he took it very, very personally. The second, of course, is that you should not forget Rio was the birthplace of the 1992 Rio Declaration on Environment. So Rio in many ways is the birthplace of sustainable development. So it's very fitting that Brazil wanted to focus on the issue of sustainable development and climate. The third thing that the Brazilians wanted to focus was on reforming global governance, global institutions. I would say these were the three. And I would say that if you ask me very frankly the kind of progress made, I would have to say to you that the glass is half full. For example, Lula in his statement said the fact that we have so much of food grains available in the world, he says any one person going hungry in the world should be unacceptable because the world has enough food to feed the entire population of the world. So the problem is something else. It is distribution, it is purchasing power, the existence of very stubborn poverty in areas. So the global alliance against hunger and poverty is, I think, the main achievement. But it remains to be seen how this will be taken forward. On climate, I would have to tell you very frankly that climate negotiators now meeting in Baku, in Azerbaijan, are somewhat disappointed that the G20 has not been able to give them a figure. There is a new collective global quantification of the amount that is needed to fight climate change. The $100 billion per year has now been achieved, but that is grossly insufficient. We need trillion or more dollars. That figure has not been supplied by the G20 to the climate negotiators in Baku. The G20 has merely wished the Baku summit well and has urged the negotiators to take things forward. On the reform of global governance, I think I find India and Brazil exactly on the same page. They have appealed for a reform of the UN Security Council. They have appealed for a reform of the WTO, and they have appealed for a reform of the IMF and the World Bank. But some would say the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When will this reform happen? Because G20 summit after summit has been talking about reform of the Security Council, reform of the WTO, and so on. But it doesn't seem to be happening. So in that sense, to answer your question very briefly, Shubhendra, I would say the glass is half full, but I see this summit, it is explicitly said a few things that it owes to the Delhi summit, but I think it's a takeoff from the Delhi summit, and Brazilians have been successful in taking things forward. In the kind of world we live in today, I think a consensus declaration is not a mean achievement. So we should all welcome the Rio G20 summit declaration.
Right, Ambassador Kumar, the point that you mentioned about G20's call for reforms that have of the global institutions that have gone unheard. Thus, let me take that point to Dr. Dash. Your key takeaways from the summit this year, sir, and the point about reforms, although the G20 has been able to reform itself from the inside. African Union joins the G20 as a full member this time over. There are 21 participants. How do you look at this edition in that context, sir?
Yeah, thanks, Sovendu. It's I think as a marker development of African Union is part of G20, and that really brings quality to the G20. First, let me share you what's my understanding of G20. G20 is not mere a talking forum; it's a working forum. Why? Because it's a forum of the dominant emergent powers as well as the emerging powers. And if the emerging powers are represented by Delhi, Modi from Delhi and now Lula from Rio de Janeiro, so Modi has got a very clear, kind of achievement list that we brought African Union. It's not we're speaking about it. So it's like you galvanize the forum, and you also bringing in all these emerging voices. And second point is that this declaration of a shared space of G20 in New Delhi, like one, kind of one family, one future, and all stuff. And now this Lula is talking about mainstreaming the voiceless in the international forum. So in that way, it's a forward match. And at the same time, also Modi is talking about it's not only my achievement records that financial and development inclusions domestically and globally, whether it's a food security, whether it is a financial capacity building, but also I'm giving you the message that back to the basics. That means basics of food, basics of shelters and all stuff that has to be looked into, and also march to the forward. The forward march is a very sustainable and clean future, and that has to be happen orchestrated in a very kind of joint and collaborative method of the emerged and emerging powers, or so to speak, developed and developing countries, emerging powers. So in that way, it makes quite a substantial sense when Modi and Lula is there talking about. And the third thing I'm talking about, when you mentioned about this food, kind of hunger and conflict and global governance, they're just not mere three kind of separate things. They are very interrelated to each other, because if you have a conflict, that leads to hunger, and conflict is there because we fail to govern globally in the manner that we should have, and that's also shared experiences. So in that way, if Lula's background, as the esteemed ambassador said, it's a very kind of forceful voice, then Modi's background, he's a delivery man. He delivers domestically and also globally. So in that way, so it's not only about kind of moral appeal, or also appeal for the people's concern, but act. And so this is the way you can move ahead. That's a march to forward, along with the back to basics.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, the centerpiece so far, the Alliance Against Hunger and Poverty, that has been being deliberated at the G20 Rio Declaration. How do you see also India's action and vision in this regard? You did mention about the resonance between the New Delhi Declaration and what has been agreed upon in Rio de Janeiro. India lifting 250 million people out of extreme multidimensional poverty. Those experiences also become significant on a platform like this?
Absolutely. And I think I share Professor Dash, whatever he said about what Prime Minister Modi has done within the country and outside. But our own experience of the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Yojana, where we, I think, have something like 800 million people who get either free or highly subsidized food grains and lentils every month. And mind you, this program has now been extended to December 2028. So I think that is the real substitute, if you like, for a social safety net that we don't have in India. But the fact that we have this, and the fact that we are going to have a health insurance scheme which covers 550 million people is, I think, significant. But the bottom line is, if something can work in India and Brazil, then I think it can work anywhere in the world. The problem today is the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal number 1, is no hunger, and Sustainable Development 2 is no poverty. And these two goals are supposed to be achieved by 2030. But the Secretary General of the UN has said that only 17% of the SDGs have been achieved by 2023. And this is more than halfway. So the SDG goals are completely off track. And this is what the Brazilian president and the Indian prime minister have been emphasizing, that without achieving the SDG goals number 1 and 2, you really are not doing justice to developing countries and least developed countries. And since Brazil is focused so much on hunger and poverty, which is SDG goal number 1 and SDG goal number 2, without achieving those, the whole SDG agenda falls on the wayside. What is the problem with achieving those goals? Pure and simply, it is lack of resources. You need money. Developed countries have not been able to fulfill their goal of transferring 0.70% of their gross national income to developing and least developed countries. This is a goal that was established by UNCTAD in 1970, and we now have given them 50 years to achieve it. Similarly, you need finance for climate change, climate finance. So frankly, it boils down to the political will that rich countries must have towards lesser rich countries or poor countries, and the fact that you need to find funds. So those really are the main focus issues, if you like, in the Rio summit.
Right. And alongside Ambassador Kumar, the G20 Rio Declaration also investigates and talks about what will ensure tackling hunger and poverty in a sustainable manner. It talks about condemnation of wars, calls for peace. And another point that you mentioned, you talked about rich countries, but it is also talking about the rich and the poor divide and the need to tax the rich to make sure that it can be a more egalitarian society. Those themes also hugely important. After the pandemic, we see these conflicts really taking in most of the resources of the regions, and poverty and hunger is what most parts of the world is left with.
No, hugely important, because I think the Rio Declaration makes a reference to both inequality within countries,
yes,
and inequality between countries, and both are growing. And this is a matter of huge concern. Lula has been extremely attached, Brazil has been attached to the idea of taxing ultra-rich, high net worth individuals. You know, we've heard the expression high net worth individuals, but Brazil and the Rio Declaration is talking about ultra high net worth individuals, which presumably means people with assets of $1 billion and more. And there are not too many. We have maybe in thousands. And Brazil has long argued for a tax on these people. But you will recall that in Rio, we had the Argentinian president who was objecting to this. Finally, they have come up with a compromise which says, without prejudice to tax sovereignty. Then they have gone on to say that we must look at the possibility of taxing ultra high net worth individuals, either to finance SDGs or to finance climate change. So you're quite right. Inequality within countries, climate finance, and the possibility of taxing ultra high net individuals so that you can find the money to actually make people's lives better in poorer countries.
Right. Dr. Dash, I'll come to you. And again, in the context of African Union, them being the newest member of the G20, how do these themes of hunger, poverty, sustainable development, more egalitarian taxation, how do these work with Africa and African Union? How do they resonate with these themes?
I think they have a substantial stake in the issues that we are talking about, with the hunger, with sustainability of development, and so on and so forth. And because and this is not only these African members of the country of African member countries have suffered or also subjected to hunger and deprivations, but also they have unfortunately witnessed a very prolonged kind of conflicts, and also they are also victims of the ill governance at the global forum. So in that way, this African Union as a kind of
And
continent.
so particularly the disparity that Ambassador Kumar was talking about between rich and the poor countries.
Yeah.
And to close that gap, in that context, how significant is the engagement with the African Union?
Yeah, it will be very significant in the sense that you have the African Union is not a very kind of uniform grouping. It has the fastest growing economies and also quite many countries with need assistance and also need handholding. So in that way, so this shading is not only at the global scale, but it also shared at regional and also kind of country level. In that way, African unions be part of G20 and then talking about how you have a financially and also kind of logistically inclusive mechanism so that your kind of issues can be shared. And then what is more important here, this African Union or for that matter India and Brazil, it's not merely about the financial kind of restructuring. It's about the global mechanism of acting on the issues that we're talking about, with hunger or kind of system of conflicts or for global governance. Because if you don't act, if you don't kind of live up to your promises, then you have that parallel kind of plurilateral setups. Now you have in that G20 forum itself, you have trilateral this kind of troika kind of groupings. So in that way, it's there is a kind of urgency, and also there is a kind of inability on the part of the developed countries to come to the terms on operational level, or else that's the reason why I told that G20 is not just a talking forum, it's a working forum. And let me tell you once again, G20 is the nucleus of the global affairs today. Because you have the kind of emerged and emerging countries that together. And now with the African Union and India is kind of making the umbrella wide of the G20, so it's becoming more a viable global forum.
Right. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, I'm eager to also be able to address the elephant in the room, as it were. The President-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, the kind of worldview that he has in the ecosystem of his thoughts. How do these pro-poor, pro-planet reforms appear? And a couple of months from now, he's going to be leading the most powerful economy in the world. In that sense, the commitments that President Biden's government makes here at this G20, how far will they be able to fulfill that? I mean, how do you see this complication here?
So it's interesting you asked me that question, and I'm so happy you asked this question. I was hesitating to make the point myself. But let me begin by saying that the G20 summit declaration, leaders' declaration from Rio, reads as if President Trump was never elected. So the first point I will make is they have decided, forget about President Trump for a minute. We will deal with whoever represents America here. And so I'll give you an example. If you look at the paragraph on the Gaza conflict, it talks of expanding humanitarian aid. It talks of emergency assistance. It talks of putting an end to the war. Now, we all know that while President Trump is viscerally opposed to the war, either in Ukraine or in Gaza, but he is basically well inclined towards Israel. And he basically tells Israel, finish the job that you were about to embark on. Only thing is, finish it before I take office. That's the message he has conveyed to Israel. Similarly, the Rio Summit Declaration talks of reiteration of commitment of the Paris Climate Change Accord goals of keeping global warming compared to pre-industrial times to even less than 1.5%. Now, it's well known that President Trump may very well become the President of the United States and get out of the Paris Accord, as he did last time. In which case, your entire chapter on climate goes for a 6. But I don't think the Rio summit leaders have bothered too much about it, and you can't blame them because he is not there. We don't know what he's going to say. It is well known that President Trump is extremely unpredictable. So, what do? You have to play with the hand you are dealt with. And the hand you are dealt with is lame duck President Biden. So, we try to make the best of it. The other thing I can honestly tell you is that the next time round, if you have President Trump attending the G20 summit, even a consensus declaration is going to be difficult. Because you remember in Italy once,
Yes.
or in Germany, I can't remember, there was a G20 declaration which said it is G20 minus one, when President Trump did not accept the final declaration. This can happen again. So, in many ways, the frank answer to your question is the leaders have decided not to see the elephant in the room. They have said, okay, we will deal with it when he comes. Who knows, he may change his mind. We will deal with President Biden. He may be lame duck, but it is still the official delegation of the United States of America. And therefore, they've gone ahead with many of these things. But you are absolutely right. Some of these things, I suspect, will have to be revisited when President Trump attends a G20 summit next year.
Right. Let's take a look at some more developments coming in from Rio de Janeiro. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi held bilateral meetings with leaders of France, Italy, Norway, Portugal, Egypt and South Korea on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio, Brazil on Monday. More details in this report.
India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi held bilateral meetings with a number of world leaders on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Prime Minister held talks with the French President Emmanuel Macron. The leaders agreed to advance cooperation between both countries in sectors such as space, defense, energy, technology and more. The leaders talked about how India and France will keep working closely in sectors like space, energy, AI, and other such futuristic areas. Prime Minister also complimented Macron on the successful hosting of the Paris Olympics and the Paralympics earlier this year. Prime Minister also held a bilateral meeting with his Portuguese counterpart Luis Montenegro. The talks focused on adding more vigor to economic linkages. Sectors like renewable energy and green hydrogen offer many opportunities for more collaboration. The leaders also talked about strong defense relations, people-to-people linkages and other such subjects. Prime Minister noted that India cherishes the long-standing ties with Portugal. Besides, Prime Minister Modi also met with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni on the sidelines of the G20 summit. The talks centered around deepening ties in defense, security, trade and technology. Leaders also talked about how to boost cooperation in culture, education and other such areas. Prime Minister said that India-Italy friendship can greatly contribute to a better planet. Besides, Prime Minister also met with Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Store. The discussions focused on ways to deepen India-Norway bilateral relations, particularly in trade and economic cooperation after the signing of the India-EFTA TEPA. The leaders also exchanged views on geopolitical issues. Prime Minister held a bilateral meeting with the Indonesian President Prabowo Subianto. Taking to social media platform, Prime Minister said that this year is special for both countries as we are marking 75 years of diplomatic relations. Talks focused on improving ties in commerce, security, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, among others. Fuzail Ahmed's report for DD India.
And as we come towards the close of this special broadcast, a quick comments from my guest, Ambassador Mohan Kumar. Your final thoughts. A number of important bilaterals, the G20 summit, of course. Key takeaways for India in this visit of the Prime Minister to Brazil.
So, yes, thank you very much. So I will repeat what I said earlier. I see this as a good continuation of what was achieved and accomplished at the Delhi summit. The fact that South Africa is going to hold the next G20 summit means that you have a golden opportunity of cementing the results further. But that is subject to President Trump appearing, and we will have to take it one step at a time. Secondly, I do believe some areas like the reform of multilateral development banks, that can be done. A women's-led group has been established for the first time in G20. There is a G20 women's group. I think that is extremely important for the achievement of gender parity, which is a separate goal in the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. And that is important not just for India, Brazil, but for a variety of countries. Last but not least, I think we should not forget that SDGs cannot be allowed to fall by the wayside. Somehow resources have to be found so that the Agenda 2030 is at least partially achieved by 2030, because right now the situation is dire and only 17% of the targets have been met. But somehow an effort has to be made by countries like India, Brazil, countries of the Global South, African Union, to make sure that we get the funding to achieve at least 50 to 60% of the SDG goals by 2030.
Okay, Dr. Dash, your concluding thoughts on the manner in which the priorities of the Global South continue to be in focus in G20, especially the troika that we're talking about, in principle at least.
I think the major takeaway of this event is the mainstreaming the Global South, as you told, and that Global South in a plane, it is not a very anti-West or is anti-Global North, but rather is a mainstreaming or giving a voice to the non-Western kind of concerns, but certainly working with the Western or the developed countries. And that's the reason why you have Troika, and the side by side you have Prime Minister Modi's had series of bilateral agreements and discussions with the developed and the emerging powers. So in that way, it's a working group. And also one more major takeaway is this, that it has a lot of prospects, because these Brazil, before that Delhi, now you have South Africa. These are very emerging, and they have quite a lot, achievement records of these countries as far as their political democracy is concerned, or for that matter, addressing the development issues and also aspirations for a well-inclusively globally governed space. So in that way, this G20 of Brazil and Rio de Janeiro in specific makes quite a big sense.
On that note, Dr. Sandipani Dash, Ambassador Mohan Kumar, thank you very much for joining us in this discussion and program, sharing your perspective. That's all for this special broadcast. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. Those were the highlights of India at G20. Stay tuned to DD India. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching this special broadcast. Namaskar.